Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in our series of 4, It Is Important. I wanted to remind you that this is a function of our professional development series for libraries that's part of our Spotty Rain campaign. We're generously funded by the National Science Foundation, and our primary goal is to share resources for managing drought risks in communities and to encourage volunteer participation in drought monitoring. And we have joining us some fabulous citizen science partners that support networks of volunteers that you can join. And you might remember we worked with Noah Newman in the first webinar from Kokoros, the Community Collaborative for Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And today I'm so excited to have Deborah Bathke with us from the National Drought Mitigation Center. We're here, or I'm here live in the Emerging Technologies and Creative Research Lab with a new member of our team, Clement, who has some ed tech technology skills, and we're so excited to have him on board and see what kinds of neat tools we can come up with for this project. And I'll introduce Tudolini Asino, who's on the road, but visiting us from his hotel room, and we're a group of OSU researchers supporting this project. Want to say hi, Tudolini?
Hello, everybody. Welcome.
I want to get my slide to go. There we go. You know, we have another quick hour today and a really interesting speaker, but we'll go ahead and just talk a little bit about the mini grant and the rain gauges, so clarify some questions people had, and then we'll get into drought monitoring and why it's important. So last time we learned a little bit about how it's easy to submit our volunteer observations about rain and conditions in our place, and how we can encourage that as a program in our library. And Deborah's going to talk to us a little bit about why and how that information is useful for monitoring drought. So our big question here is, what does citizen science look like in the library, and particularly what does drought monitoring look like in the library? And I think last time we focused on this reports part, submitting rainfall and drought observations. And today we're going to take a step back and maybe look at the track function. So what can people do in the library to learn about and be drought monitors? And the National Drought Mitigation Center plays a big role in providing some of our understanding of how that happens across the nation. You know, I'm so glad you're here with us in the webinar. What is our final participant count? I didn't see. So glad to see you again and have your interest. Keep watching the webinars, and we have an opportunity for small rural librarians in the Great Plains to get a $250 stipend to support a program and some rain gauges. And if you have any questions about that along the way, send Tudolini or I a quick message. And if you're not in the Great Plains, send us a message anyway, because we've having great success working with Kokoros to find other resources for you to do related programs in your area. And so thank you for being here, and I want to welcome Deborah Bathke and her cohort Tanya Bernhardt, who are live in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Drought Mitigation Center, to take over and share with us the work they do.
Okay, let's see if I can get this share screen to work.
I'm sure it'll.
Can you see it?
Not yet.
You can't see it? Why?
You did get on board 30 minutes early to practice this out, so thank you for your patience.
And I don't know why it's not working now. I did the exact same thing I did last time. Oh, except I forgot to actually click share.
There we go.
There's Tanya's kid.
All right, thank you everyone for your patience while I figure out technology again. I have titled, again, my name is Deborah Bathke. I'm with the National Drought Mitigation Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I am a climatologist and the Education and Outreach Coordinator for our center. I've titled my talk today, Drought Happens, Get Savvy, Be Involved in Health Science. And the picture that I'm showing on the front is of a library in California. And if you notice the sign, it says, "Due to the drought, the grass is out." And what they decided to do at this library was to remove the grass and put in drought-tolerant landscaping. And they were thinking just in doing that, it would save them several $1,000s a year on their water bills. Let's see, next slide. So National Drought Mitigation Center is located at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. My 7-year-old son thought it'd be really cool to use a lightning bolt to show where that is on the map. And the map that I'm showing here is of the drought in August of 2012. And this drought encompassed about 60 to 65% of the agricultural lands in the United States. And I can't remember where everyone on the webinar is from. I know we had people from Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado. Nicole or anyone, can you?
Yep, Illinois, Iowa, Wyoming.
So pretty much everyone was impacted by drought during 2012.
Kansas, yep.
So just real quick about the National Drought Mitigation Center. Our center has been around for almost 25 years. We're having our 25th anniversary next year. And our mission is to help reduce the negative effects of drought. And that's for individuals, for communities, for states, we even work with international governments. And we do that by doing research and providing information related to drought planning, which can help increase the ability to cope through monitoring. So if you know where there's a drought and how bad it is, you can use that to help you to trigger actions. And then also by, which is probably most applicable for those on the webinar, is by providing educational materials to help translate all of the drought science into practice, into more digestible information. So my topics today are basically the 4 things in my title. So let's start with drought happens. And the first thing I have is a poll question. So Lenny, if you want to bring the poll question up. And mine is, what is the worst drought that you remember? And I put some of the more notable droughts of the last, I don't know, the last few years or so, and the Dust Bowl just in case. Is the poll question coming? There it is.
Yeah, the last most recent drought was pretty severe. I know the 50s were bad too. We often talk about the Dust Bowl, but the 50s were severe.
The 50s were really severe. The 88 drought was significant in that it hit the Corn Belt really hard. So that's around that time was when a lot of farms, people quit farming or lost their farms during that drought. 2012. That's probably to be expected, given that there's been, given where our audience is, now there's been other droughts that didn't cover quite the area, but depending on what part of the country that you lived in.
Yeah.
Right. Can I close this? I can close that. All right. Next slide. So this next slide shows that drought happens regularly. This is for the period that we have instrumental observations, so where we have actual rain gauge measurements that we can, and temperature measurements that we can track drought using those. And what's shown here is an index called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And all this index basically does is it combines temperature and precipitation data to give you an indicator of how dry it is. And when we look at this graph, the positive values means that it's wet, negative values means that it's dry, that we can see the relative dryness of all of the droughts that I had mentioned on the last slide. And if we look at the Dust Bowl, that lasted for a long time, and that shows up as probably the driest period in our recent record. One thing that you might notice from looking at it, that dark purple line is the time average smoothing to let us see kind of some broad scale patterns. But if you look at the lighter line, you can see that even within those dry periods, it jumps up and down. And so we have, even though it was the Dust Bowl, there were a couple years where they had some close to normal amounts of rain, but overall, the whole period was dry. And if we look even farther back in time, now this graph basically shows the same thing. The blue is wet, the red is dry, and instead of using the instrument data from weather station, this uses tree ring data. So it uses how much the tree grew or didn't grow to tell us about how wet and how dry that it was. And when we look at this, we notice a couple periods. We can see the Dust Bowl in this first box that I highlighted where it is, and look how short that looks compared to the droughts from 1,000 years ago, which they called mega droughts. And these droughts lasted 100 years or more. And so while we've had bad droughts now, they used to be a lot worse. And they could be a lot worse again in the future. So our second topic then is getting drought savvy. How can you learn about droughts? So I have a question, and that is, it seems like a simple question. What is drought? We all think we know what it means. I want you to just take a second to think about when, and hopefully my picture won't influence you too much. I guess I should have used something less stark like that. What comes to mind when you think of the word drought? If someone tells you that a drought is happening, what are your first thoughts? And then remember that as we go through this section. So I'll think we know what drought means. In its most general sense, drought is defined as a deficit of expected water availability that results in shortages for some activity or group. And I have some words highlighted there because they're pretty important, and then they tell us how this definition can quickly get complicated. So a deficit of expected water availability. Well, that just basically means we're not getting as much rain as we're used to getting. Well, we know this just from talking with our neighbors and our family, that depending on where you live, the rain can be very different. And so even just across town or across the state, or if we even go farther across the world. So this means that depending on where you live, the amount of water that you expect to get is going to vary. And so that means how you define drought will vary. The second group of words that are highlighted are those water shortages for some activity or group. And depending on who or what you are, you have different needs for water. So a municipal, a community with a municipal water supply will have different needs for the amount of water that, or will have different amounts of water that they need versus what animals in the environment need versus what an industry needs. So that can also affect the definition of drought. So each group will think of drought differently. And then finally, something that applies to both is the timing of that precipitation. So the amount of precipitation that we expect varies by where we live and by the time of year. And then also when people need that water varies the time of year. farmers won't need the water as much in the winter months as they do in the summer. And so those shortages during the summer can have a greater impact than maybe in other times of year. Another important thing about drought is we know it happens, and it has happened, it used to be worse, that it can affect almost every part of the community. And here are some impacts on different sectors of the community that I pulled from observations reports of volunteers across the country. And some of these that have shown up are production declines and unemployment, not just in agriculture, but in anything that is impacted by water use. So it could be agriculture, it could be food processing based on agriculture. Declines in ecosystem functioning. So that just means that the plants and animals are impacted either by reduced amounts of water or even lower water quality. Clearly, water supply is affected. Energy can be affected, not just for hydropower, but also because many plants will use water to cool, for cooling, for producing electricity. And if we don't have enough water for that, or if the water is too shallow and too warm, then it can't serve its purpose. Increased illnesses and disease from declining water and air quality, so respiratory issues, even vector-borne illnesses such as West Nile virus can increase during drought. And within the community, canceled festivals and competitions. We probably, during 2012, maybe some of you saw or remember fireworks being canceled or pools being closed. And then an issue that we had here in Lincoln and Omaha were foundations cracked because of the drought. The ground was really dry, and so it started to sink and contract, and that caused damage to foundations. So as I mentioned during the definitions of drought slides, that drought means different things to different people. So depending on where they live, depending on the time of year, depending on what group they identify with. And sometimes you can see this, it's called drought definitions, the ways we define drought. I like to think of it more as, not so hard and fast as a definition, but more as the perspective or the lens that you're looking at drought through. When scientists looked at the scientific literature, they saw, I think it was well over 200 different ways that people talk about drought. And some research in the late 80s, early 90s, and even up until last year, was able to group these different perspectives into these, 5 categories. So the meteorological drought, so basically, are you looking at it through the amount of rainfall or the high temperatures? Is that what you're thinking about? Are you looking at it through the lens of agriculture in terms of, is the soil moisture really dry, or is the amount of evaporation really dry, and that's impacting the crops and the production? Are you looking at it from a water supply issue in terms of the reservoirs or the stream flows or your private and municipal wells? Are you looking at it from the standpoint of the environment, where there could be dried vegetation and wildfires or increased pest outbreaks? Or are you looking at it from the impact on society in terms of the demand for different goods and services? And so my next question is, I asked you, when you think about drought, what comes to mind? What perspective are you thinking about drought through, or what lens are you looking at drought through?
gonna end the poll and share the results.
Agriculture, and that's pretty common. That's probably the most common, what people think about when they think about drought. Let me see, how do I advance? So the purpose of this talk was drought monitoring, and so now I'm finally getting to the drought monitoring part. And when we monitor for drought, or that just means track drought conditions, we can look at it through these individual perspectives, and lots of different tools and maps and products have been developed to reflect those different perspectives. Like, for example, we have maps that show what drought health, what the plant health looks like during a drought, or the rain and snow deficits, how short are we in our total amount compared to what we normally get, or how low are the streams and the rivers, or how dry is the soil, or how is it impacting fire danger. So monitoring can capture these individual perspectives, and there's many more than what I've shown here, or it can integrate multiple perspectives, and that's what the product that people are probably most familiar with, the U.S. Drought Monitor, tries to do. It tries to take those 5 different perspectives and integrate into one map. And the reason that it does that is because that's what the decision makers and the politicians wanted, was one map that they could look at to tell them where the drought was occurring and how severe that the drought is. If you want to learn more about drought, I could talk about drought all day or for several days, but I'm not going to. But if you want to learn more, we do have information on our website at drought.unl.edu with a /education. And we've got just some general information. We've got some tutorials on the map. We've got a drought game that can be downloaded and printed out and played in the community. So lots of different things. And the next slide is, I showed you that map of the U.S. Drought Monitor, is how can you be involved in the creation of that map. When we talk about the U.S. Drought Monitor, we say the Drought Monitor is a product, it's the map, but it's also a process. And it's a process that relies on participation by the community and different groups of people at all of the levels of the map's creation. So from the very beginning, setting the methods and the standards for the map, so that it was going to be one product, and then it's going to have 4 levels of drought and a drought warning level, that it's going to use the colors of yellow to warmer colors of red. All of those were set by the 3 partner agencies, so the National Drought Mitigation Center, which is us here in Lincoln, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So the map has always been a partnership between those 3 groups. The data that we put into the map, it's a combination of objective data, so measures of rainfall and temperature and stream flow and plant health, comes from over a dozen different agencies, all of whom have agreed to make it available at a given time so that we can grab that data and pull it into our computer system and to put it in the format that we need. And then the subjective data, which is the drought impact reports that come from the general public or people like you, that helps us tell the story of the drought and what's happening on the ground and in your community. The making of the map, it comes out every week, and so the authors, of which I'm one, we have about 3 days to pull probably 50-some different pieces of data together, as well as look at your impact reports and decide what that map is going to look like every week. And so the authors come from, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different agencies right now. Our requirement is that you have to be at a national or regional center to do that. And we have 3 of us here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. So authors rotate. We do a map typically for 2 weeks, and then another person takes it on. And then we also have more subjective expertise that comes in, which we call our local experts. And we have a listserv of over 400 people that we send drafts of the map out to every week, and they give us feedback based on their expert opinion of their area. When I do the map, I'm here in Lincoln. I don't know what drought means in all of the different parts of the country. So having the participation of those local experts from universities and state and government agencies really helps make the map a more reliable product. And then finally, in the distribution of the map, the National Drought Mitigation Center is the home for the map, which means that we have it on our website. We store all the past data for the map on our website. But then countless other agencies distribute that map through their own sites. We actually have the link so they can embed it into their own website, and it can update every week when it becomes available. And they send it out through newsletters and various other things as well. So we talked about I mentioned the different data that goes into the map and how we have lots of different pieces of data. And this is just a general information type of things, that this data normally falls into categories of rainfall, soil moisture, vegetation health, surface water, so stream flows, maybe lake levels, reservoir levels, the amount of evaporation, and groundwater if we have it, and then your impact reports. And we incorporate all of that different data, and we look at it across different time scales. So we look what's happened in the last month, because drought can be compounding in that the longer you have drought, the worse effects you're going to get. We look at it even on a seasonal basis, and in some cases we look at it like the drought in California. We look back several years to see how it has evolved and what those impacts are going to be. And how we get the colors on the map is based on the historical likelihood. This is just showing you that we use what are called percentiles. So if you have kids, you're probably familiar with that. I just took my son to the doctor, and he's in the 86th percentile in height and 50th percentile in weight, so he's tall and skinny. And that's what we use to do the drought categories. That if we have 100 years of data, and we take, for example, the amount of rainfall in a month, and we rank it from all the months, all the Septembers from the last 100 years, and put the most at the top and the least at the bottom. If the amount for the current month falls within the lowest 2, that's the darkest color on the map, or the worst drought severity. And then it continues on depending on where it falls in those numbers. So how does this work? If it sounds like a complicated process, it's because it is a very complicated process. As the authors, we call this whole process a convergence of evidence. So we have all of these different pieces of information that we're trying to put together. And whatever story most of the pieces of evidence are telling us, so if we look at rainfall and it shows that it's the dark red color when we look at it, and we look at stream flow and it's the dark red color, then we'll probably put that as a dark red color on the map. But this is how it works. We have the author. They get the objective data in, and it goes into a computer system called GIS, which is Geographic Information System, and that allows us to overlay all of these maps and kind of see where how the conditions are behaving in these different measurements across the country. We also look at the impact reports that private citizens across the country submit, and we look at all of that first and get an idea, try and get a general idea of what's happening with drought, and we put out a draft map. So maps come out every Thursday. We usually start this process on Sunday or Monday. We put out a draft. We then send it out to our network of local experts, who often have their own network that they distribute the map to and they get feedback from. And then through that point person, we get the feedback. We typically send out anywhere between 3 and 5 drafts between Sunday and Wednesday. On Thursday morning, the final map is released on our website, and then many other groups and agencies distribute it through their own networks. So how can you be part of the process? And that's through COCORAS, which Noah talked about the last time, talked in depth about COCORAS and how to measure it. And you can put rainfall measurements in. You can tell us the relative degree of wetness or dryness that you're seeing at the library. And then the National Drought Mitigation Center also has a tool called the Drought Reporter. And in this tool, you can even upload pictures as well. So why would you want to do this? Why would you want to volunteer to be part of this process? And the main reason is to help science. Science relies on observations. That's the basis of all science everywhere. And by being part of the USDM or the Drought Monitor process, you can help advance our understanding of drought. And in doing so, you can have an impact on many projects and programs. And I'm just going to talk about a few of them here. So the first is, oops, I labeled those both National Weather Service, and that is not right. You can help the U.S. Drought Monitor authors fill in the gaps. Even though we have a lot of data, that data is not evenly distributed across the country. And we all know this, if you check the weather and you see the amount of rain, like for us here in Lincoln, the airport where the rainfall measurements are way on the northwest side of town, and Tanya and I live way on the south side of town, and so it's not always the same amount. So by being part of COCORAS, you can help us fill in the gaps. Now with COCORAS, COCORAS is the one on the right, the one with the smaller dots. We don't have that historical perspective, but it at least shows us as a Drought Monitor author if it rained there or not, and if we can warrant improvements or degradations on the map based on that. Another thing that the impacts that have been provided by through our Drought Impact Reporter and the COCORAS site is that it has given us data where we were able to make state-specific impact tables. Now, for the last, 20 years, there's been this general impact table that explains or shows some of the impacts that you might get when your area is in each of these colors on the map. And they're very general. It says, going into drought, you might get some slowing of plant growth. And those gradually get worse as you go through. Well, maybe not everywhere has crops that we think of in the central part of the U.S. or pasture land. And so this table isn't applicable to everywhere. So one of our graduate students combed through thousands of impacts for all 50 states plus Puerto Rico to make state-specific tables. And I don't expect you to read all of these, but here's one for Nebraska, here's one for Colorado. And just looking at some of the impacts, we can see that they both have decreases in hunting and that fish kills claim thousands of fish, but notice how in Nebraska when they've occurred, it was split up, that we saw fish kills as early as D3, but we didn't see the hunting reduction until we got to that worst drought, that once or twice in a 100-year drought that we saw the decreases in the hunting. But in Colorado, they saw those both at the D3 times. So the impact data was really important to help us understand what drought looks like in different parts of the country. If you've ever seen, I guess I should have asked the question, how many people have seen the U.S. Drought Monitor? If you get it from our website, and I'm not sure how many people know this, that along with the map that is released every week, there is a summary that explains the changes on the map. And this is a new map just came out today, so this is last week's map now. And those changes, just last week in the Virgin Islands, their whole reason for making the map changes primarily came from COCORA's information, and that helped tell the story of what was happening on the ground. And the reports that you submit through COCORA's are used to ground truth or to help verify many of the products that go into drought monitoring. And I threw this in just for the librarians that when I did a Google Scholar search for this validating precipitation with COCORA's data, we had over 353 results. So COCORA's and inputting drought impacts and rainfall data has been very important to the science of drought. And the impact reports, kind of what I've been talking about, are just one piece of our puzzle that's the drought monitor, how we put everything together. And so by being part of that puzzle, whether it's through the science or through the weekly analysis, the participation goes beyond just science and helps out communities. Different ways that the drought monitor is used. It's distributed through the media. I think most major branches show the map at some point in time. Fire managers use the map to determine where to allocate resources. Policymakers use the map. Certain states and communities, if their area goes into that orange color on the drought map, they may start voluntary water conservation. Or if it's in a red, it may be mandatory conservation. And then finally, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has distributed billions, I think it's over $7 billion in aid since 2008 through their livestock forage program based on the conditions of the U.S. Drought Monitor. And that's all I have. Hopefully you were able to learn a little bit about drought monitoring, where you can find more resources, how you can be involved and be part of the process, and why it's important. So if you have any questions, I am happy to take them. I think the preference is you type them in the text box, correct, Nicole?
Yep. So we had one lingering since we were back at the beginning at your initial graphs. So Clux is asking, are these drought patterns normal and cyclical? So I guess a good point is that we regular citizens think normal is, you know, what we come to expect, and I think a climatologist thinks of normal in 30-year periods. So I wanted to point that out. But what could we say to them about the drought patterns that we're seeing in those graphs? Were they normal, cyclical?
Some of it depends on where you live. Some parts of the country that are very strongly influenced by El Niño and La Niña, such as the Pacific Northwest and the southern part of the U.S., you can correlate drought to some extent with those patterns. Here in the central part of the U.S., where Nebraska is, it's kind of hit or miss based on what happens in what we call El Niño, La Niña, and other patterns in the ocean and in the atmosphere. So it depends on where you are and what's driving it. And unfortunately, we don't know all of that yet. There's still a lot to learn.
I want to invite everybody that's on to type in any questions they might have for Deb. It's a super unique experience to get to have a climatologist to answer our questions, and whatever you have, whether it's related to drought or just in general about what you heard, please go ahead and type it in.
And you don't have to ask them now. If you think of questions later, or if during a drought you think of questions, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Otherwise, there's my information. And a good part of my job is reaching out to communities, Tanya's as well. And so we are always happy to do that.
Yeah, man, I am so thankful for the National Drought Mitigation Center's support of this project, and we've been talking for a long time about doing this project, and it's so nice to be here and think about what role libraries could play in helping us understand drought and plan and react to it. So I thank you so much, Deb. And Tanya for being here. Let's see if I can get my slide to change.
Let me do I can do my stop sharing, I think.
I think we'll wait for some more questions. We'll have Dr. Sino pop up a poll. We're just curious at the end of this, after thinking about the impacts of drought, how does your library respond to droughts? We have a couple of ways. Maybe you stop watering, or maybe you're holding public programs. We'd like to know about your role in that.
And I think if you haven't done that and you're ever interested in doing that, let us know. We don't always have money to go to events, but sometimes we can make it work. So.
Yep. I also, we want to make sure on our SpottyRain.org website, we're just throughout the course of this project going to keep adding resources that we think will be practical for programs and libraries. When we just visited with Tanya at the Iowa-Nebraska Library Association, she brought a big cutout of their drought scenario game. And so I was thinking this is a pretty neat way that a library might involve people in discussions like this. And my understanding of the game, and maybe you can correct me, Deborah, is you kind of each take a role-playing scenario. So I can be the mayor and you could be the librarian, and someone else could be an agriculturalist, and we can talk about how we should manage our water supplies. So that's what might be an avenue for a public discussion about drought in the library.
And I know that during a drought, especially in the rural communities, because of that livestock forage program, which is ag relief money based on the drought monitor, there's always lots of questions about how the map is produced. And I just gave a quick overview today, but Tanya and I spent a significant amount of time putting together some video tutorials on that process that libraries, we would love it if they would share that and make that available too, to help us educate people on how that works and why the map says what it does. So.
Yeah, so the drought monitor map is used to determine how the USDA divvies out some of that disaster relief. So your designation is really important. Lots of times it's based on 90 days or more of drought. So when I was doing my field work in the Panhandle, there were, conservation district FSA officers who were involved in knowing what was going on in their county. And so your observations or observations of people can help give an idea, like Deb was saying, if the area is an improvement or degradation. And I know here in Oklahoma, our state meteorologist is active in seeking people's feedback. So a lot of those COGRAS volunteers, so as you join the network, you'll get connected with your regional or county level COGRAS coordinators, and a lot of those are people are stakeholders in map making too, are interested in doing science related to this. So I'm hoping through the course of the project we'll be able to connect with some other scientists at our land-grant universities who use this localized data for their research. So, here in Oklahoma, there's a large research group in agriculture down in the south, and those micro-level rain data that you and your community could provide help them to do more localized research. It was the information that they wouldn't have otherwise. Maybe there would be only one or two Mesonet or National Weather Service stations there.
Especially in those lower populated areas, those COGRAS stations are vital.
Yes, yeah. So that's cool that I can see some librarians at Cup 4 think about reducing their water consumption and changing their practices. And my experience going around with libraries, I can see that you often have butterfly gardens or courtyards, and so I can see how drought might affect that process. Here we are at 12:47, and I don't see any more questions popping up, so I just want to thank you for being here. I want to remind you to go to this link right here, the tiny URL on the screen, and maybe we'll copy and paste it and put it in the chat for them to click on right now. I think this one's even shorter than the last one, which is estimated to take 8 minutes. Just some feedback about the webinar, the content and its usefulness, and then we're thinking ahead to our next webinar where we want to share some simple tools with you for looking at precipitation and temperature histories in your place. So where's some information and how can we share that with our patrons in an easy way? And so I asked you to include with us maybe some examples of weather memories that you have, drought memories that you have, or extreme weather. Maybe we can use some of those events as the context for our talking next time to make it more interesting. Again, I encourage you to join the listserv if you haven't, and to follow us on Twitter. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 more weeks on a Friday, where we've learned that it's easy and it's important, and now we want to talk about it's local and what's happening with you in your place, and tools that you can use with your patrons to find out more. And that will include looking a little bit more at the COPEROS tools, the maps, and ways to use the manipulation of that data as you start to contribute to it, and also Deb and the National Drought Mitigation Center's drought monitor map. So you can actually pull and create pretty easy images on a weekly basis from that monitor map, and we want to show you how to do that. So everybody, stay warm, stay dry, get wet, whatever you need. And have a good day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.